In the late 1990s, inside a brightly lit American discount store, a shopper could walk down the electronics aisle and find the name Magnavox, printed across the top of a $10 plastic clock radio. The device weighed barely a few ounces. Its digital display glowed a harsh red. It was designed to wake a sleeper, play a static-filled AM traffic report, and eventually be thrown away. The name on the plastic casing was merely a licensed badge, pasted onto a generic imported circuit board. Half a century earlier, that exact same name had meant precisely the opposite. Magnavox was the engineering giant that had physically invented the moving coil loudspeaker, the core technology that gave every radio its voice. But the real story of Magnavox is not only the story of a premium American radio phonograph maker absorbed into the budget retail shelf. It is the story of how an acoustic empire that once commanded the center of the American living room was quietly dismantled by the shift from handcrafted furniture to disposable electronics. Every week, we tell the stories of American radios, broadcast empires, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard music and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in Napa, California, in 1915. Before the winter of 1915, American radio was a strictly solitary experience. To hear a wireless transmission, a listener had to sit alone, hunched over a wooden table, pressing a heavy pair of Bakelite headphones against their ears. Early crystal sets and the first primitive tube receivers, radios that used glass vacuum tubes to amplify weak signals before the transistor era, could barely produce enough electrical current to vibrate a small metal disc inside an earpiece. A family could not gather around a broadcast. A room could not be filled with music. The signal belonged only to the person wearing the headset. The American living room, soon to be the most important entertainment market in the world, remained entirely silent. The breakthrough did not happen in a massive corporate laboratory in New York or New Jersey. It happened in Napa, California, inside a small wooden workshop. Two engineers, a Danish immigrant named Peter L. Jensen and an American named Edwin S. Predum, had established the Commercial Wireless and Development Company. They were not initially trying to revolutionize home entertainment. They were trying to build a better telephone receiver to compete with the dominant Bell monopoly. Working with heavy electromagnets and copper wire, Jensen and Predum stumbled upon a distinctly different application. They attached a coil of wire to a stiff diaphragm, a thin, flexible membrane, and suspended it within a strong magnetic field. When electrical audio signals passed through the coil, the magnetic forces caused the coil and the diaphragm to vibrate violently, pushing the surrounding air in exact time with the electrical current. This was the moving coil loudspeaker, a device that physically translated electrical energy into massive acoustic output. On December 10, 1915, they carried their crude prototype to a hillside in Napa. They connected it to a phonograph and a heavy battery. The sound of a singing voice blasted across the valley, echoing for more than a mile. They had created the first true loudspeaker. They named their invention Magnavox, drawing from Latin to mean great voice. The original Magnavox speaker was initially too large, too heavy, and too power-hungry for an average household. Instead, it became an American public spectacle. On Christmas Eve of 1915, Jensen and Predum set up their speakers in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, projecting music to a crowd of nearly 100,000 people. 4 years later, in September 1919, President Woodrow Wilson stood before a crowd of 50,000 in San Diego, California. For the first time in American history, a president's voice was amplified by two massive Magnavox horns suspended above the stadium, allowing every citizen in the arena to hear his speech clearly. But the American market was about to shift from the stadium grandstand to the living room couch. In November 1920, station KDKA in Pittsburgh made the first commercial radio broadcast. Suddenly, Radio was no longer just for maritime signaling or amateur hobbyists. It was news, music, and daily entertainment. And listeners no longer wanted to wear headphones. They wanted the sound in the room. To meet the explosion in consumer demand, the newly incorporated Magnavox company began manufacturing standalone horn speakers for home use. In the early 1920s, an American listener could walk into a local hardware store or early electronics retailer and purchase a Magnavox R3 horn speaker for about $45, a massive sum at the time, roughly equivalent to 2 weeks' wages for an average factory laborer. These early horns were visually imposing, resembling large black or brass musical instruments sitting on top of wooden boxes, and they required heavy external batteries to power their field coils. As the 1920s progressed, the radio market matured rapidly. The massive acoustic horns were replaced by paper cones housed inside wooden cabinets. Magnavox supplied hundreds of thousands of dynamic speakers to other American radio manufacturers, becoming the hidden acoustic engine for competing brands across the country. But corporate leadership realized that simply supplying components left them vulnerable to brutal price wars, changing contracts, and the whims of other receiver manufacturers. To survive the intensifying competition of the 1930s, Magnavox had to build the entire system. They needed to control the radio receiver, the audio amplifier, the wooden cabinet, and the speaker itself. In a highly strategic geographic shift, Magnavox relocated its core manufacturing and corporate headquarters from California to Fort Wayne, Indiana. This move fundamentally reshaped the company. Indiana and the surrounding Midwestern states were the heart of the American furniture industry. By moving to Fort Wayne, Magnavox positioned itself directly alongside the highly skilled cabinet makers, woodworkers, and varnishers needed to turn a piece of electronic machinery into a piece of fine living room furniture. Under the guidance of visionary executives like Frank Fryman, Magnavox shifted its identity. They were no longer just a speaker company. They began designing integrated radio phonographs, large floor-standing wooden consoles that combined a high-fidelity tube radio, a record player, a powerful audio amplifier, and a massive dynamic speaker into one elegant cabinet. Records suggest that by the late 1930s, Magnavox was deliberately stepping away from the low-margin, high-volume price wars that were destroying cheaper tabletop radio manufacturers. While other brands fought over the $20 kitchen radio market, Magnavox aimed explicitly at the upper-middle-class living room. They established a strict direct-to-dealer retail model, bypassing wholesale distributors entirely. A Magnavox radio could not be bought in a cheap discount store or ordered from a generic mail-order catalog. It had to be purchased from a franchised Magnavox dealer, usually a dedicated high-end music store or an elite Main Street department store. This was the American radio moat. The company had invented the physical voice of the radio in a California laboratory, but it built its commercial empire in an Indiana factory. By controlling the acoustics, the electronics, the cabinetry, and the retail floor, Magnavox promised the American listener something more than just adequate reception. They promised absolute acoustic authority, wrapped in hand-rubbed mahogany. By the late 1930s, the American radio manufacturing industry was locked in a brutal race to the bottom. The Great Depression had crushed consumer spending, forcing many radio companies to survive by producing smaller, cheaper, lower-quality receivers. Retailers flooded the market with midget radios, compact, inexpensive tabletop sets, packed into thin wooden or early plastic cabinets. These radios often sold for less than $20 in discount hardware stores, cut-rate electronics shops, and generic mail-order catalogs. They were functional, but their sound was inherently thin, brittle, and quiet. Magnavox, under the strategic direction of executive Frank Fryman, realized that trying to compete in this low-margin, high-volume price war was a corporate death sentence. Fryman had merged his own high-end custom radio business, Electro Acoustic Products Company, with Magnavox in the early 1930s, and he brought with him a fundamentally different vision for the American radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound. Freeman decided that Magnavox would not make the radio smaller and cheaper. Instead, they would make it larger, vastly more expensive, and acoustically unparalleled. The breakthrough was the creation of the premium Magnavox radio phonograph console. This was not a device meant to be shoved onto a crowded kitchen counter. It was a massive, floor-standing home entertainment system, combining a high-fidelity AM radio receiver and a record player inside a single, meticulously crafted piece of cabinetry. To achieve this, Magnavox leveraged its unique position in Fort Wayne, Indiana, drawing on the deep expertise of Midwestern furniture makers. A radio cabinet is not simply a decorative wooden box. Acoustically, it acts as a baffle, a physical barrier that prevents sound waves emerging from the back of the loudspeaker from wrapping around and canceling the sound waves coming from the front. A heavy, rigid, well-constructed cabinet prevents unwanted resonance and rattling, allowing the speaker to produce deep, clear, distortion-free bass. Inside these heavy mahogany, walnut, and cherry cabinets, Magnavox engineers installed highly sensitive super-heterodyne receivers, advanced circuits that mix the incoming broadcast signal with a locally generated frequency to drastically improve reception and selectivity, which is how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations. They paired these tuners with powerful, heavy-duty audio amplifiers, and at the bottom of the cabinet, pointing directly into the room, sat the company's own proprietary invention, a massive 12-inch or 15-inch Magnavox electrodynamic loudspeaker. The physical experience of operating a late 1930s Magnavox console was designed to feel like a luxury event. The listener would lift the heavy wooden lid, supported by polished brass hinges. They would turn the solid volume control, the knob that changes the loudness of the sound, and watch the warm amber glow illuminate the expansive tuning dial, the glass scale that showed exactly which station the radio was tuned to. As the vacuum tubes warmed up, the room would fill with a physical, authoritative sound that no cheap tabletop radio could ever replicate. But building an expensive, high-fidelity radio was only half the battle. The true breakthrough was how Magnavox sold it. In 1937, a premium Magnavox console could cost anywhere from $200 to $800, an enormous investment equivalent to buying a reliable used car at the time. You could not sell an $800 piece of acoustic engineering by placing it on a dusty shelf next to a $20 toaster. To protect the brand and justify the price, Freeman engineered one of the most effective distribution moats in American consumer electronics history, the Magnavox direct-to-dealer franchise model. Magnavox entirely eliminated the wholesale distributor. They refused to sell their radios to generic appliance chains or discount catalogs. Instead, a Magnavox could only be purchased at an authorized, strictly vetted franchise dealer. Freeman handpicked these retailers, ensuring they had elegant showrooms, knowledgeable sales staff, and dedicated service departments. By the early 1940s, the Magnavox network included some of the most prestigious retail addresses in America. A customer looking for the ultimate listening experience would find Magnavox consoles standing proudly in the quiet listening rooms of Liberty Music Shops on Madison Avenue in New York. They were showcased at Lion & Healy, the legendary music retailer in Chicago. They sat on the polished floors of Sherman, Clay & Company in San Francisco, and inside the high-end Barker Brothers furniture department store in Los Angeles. Across the American Midwest, Magnavox partnered with elite Main Street music and appliance dealers, all of whom signed strict agreements to maintain the retail price. This retail strategy solved a critical tension in the American market, proving that a complex piece of electronic machinery could also be considered fine furniture. By selling through high-end music and furniture stores, Magnavox bypassed the intimidating, wire-filled aesthetic of the early radio shop. The cabinet had to impress the American housewife, who historically controlled the aesthetic choices of the living room, while the raw acoustic power and superior reception had to satisfy the husband, who was often making the technical purchasing decision. The strategy was a phenomenal success. While other radio manufacturers saw their profit margins evaporate in cutthroat retail wars, Magnavox maintained its prestige, its pricing power, and its aura of exclusivity. They had transformed their original California invention, the moving coil loudspeaker, from a public address novelty into the ultimate symbol of domestic success. The name on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. Following World War II, the American landscape physically changed. Millions of families moved into newly constructed suburban homes across the country. From the expanding subdivisions of Long Island, New York, to the sprawling ranch houses of Southern California. These new homes featured a designated architectural focal point, the large open family living room. And by the 1950s, the ultimate symbol of American domestic arrival was a massive, hand-rubbed mahogany Magnavox radio phonograph console occupying the center wall. This was the era of the magnificent Magnavox. The company was no longer just an innovative California acoustics firm. It was a dominant industrial and cultural force. To meet the post-war demand for high-end home entertainment, Magnavox had to drastically scale up its manufacturing while strictly maintaining its premium acoustic and visual quality. The primary Fort Wayne, Indiana facilities focused on the heavy, complex electronics. Hundreds of American line workers hand-wired massive steel chassis, soldered intricate vacuum tube circuits, and assembled the heavy magnetic structures for their famous 12-inch and 15-inch loudspeakers. But the limiting factor for mass production was the wood. A Magnavox console required the same exact craftsmanship as a fine dining room table. To solve this, Magnavox expanded its operations deep into Greenville, Tennessee, eventually establishing what would become one of the largest dedicated electronics cabinetry plants in the world. Inside the massive Greenville facility, skilled American woodworkers, sanders, and finishers milled raw cherry, oak, and walnut into acoustically sealed speaker baffles and elegant French provincial, early American, or Danish modern furniture pieces. When these heavy consoles were finally boxed and loaded onto trucks, they bypassed the generic appliance discounters entirely. They were shipped directly to the most trusted high-end retail floors in the country. An American buyer could browse the new Magnavox line at J.L. Hudson's massive department store in Detroit, Gimbel's in New York, or Bullock's in Los Angeles. In smaller regional markets, they were sold exclusively through franchised independent music dealers, places like the Schmaler and Muller Piano Company in Omaha, Nebraska, or the Grinnell Brothers music chain across Michigan. This strict direct-to-dealer network ensured that the retail price remained fixed, the profit margins for the dealer remained high, and the prestige of the brand remained untouched by the discount wars happening in the hardware stores down the street. By the late 1950s, the American radio market was rapidly fracturing. Teenagers were beginning to carry cheap, imported Japanese transistor radios, small, portable radios that used efficient semiconductor devices instead of hot glass tubes, out into the streets and beaches to listen to AM Top 40 countdowns. But Magnavox deliberately ignored the teenager with the pocket radio. They focused entirely on the adult in the living room who wanted to listen to the new, static-free fidelity of the FM dial. FM radio, frequency modulation broadcasting, which changes the frequency of the radio wave to carry clearer, wider-range sound with less static, was just beginning to broadcast high-quality classical music, jazz, and easy-listening formats to affluent adult audiences. Inside a top-of-the-line 1958 Magnavox Concert Grand Console, the sheer weight of the engineering was staggering. The cabinet often weighed over 200 pounds. The internal electronics included dual heavy-duty audio amplifiers producing 50 watts of raw tube power. The radio receiver featured a precision AM/FM tuner equipped with a Magic Eye tuning tube, a small glowing green vacuum tube that physically closed its visual gap when the listener perfectly locked onto a broadcast signal, ensuring maximum reception clarity. By 1960, Magnavox was grossing over $100 million annually, a massive figure driven entirely by the strict control of their American manufacturing and their exclusive retail pipelines. They had successfully convinced the American middle class that buying a radio was not just buying an appliance. It was an investment in permanent household architecture. The golden age of the American radio console reached its absolute zenith in the spring of 1961. That year, the Federal Communications Commission officially approved the Zenith GE standard for FM stereo, a broadcasting method that transmits separate left and right audio channels over a single radio frequency to create a realistic, three-dimensional sense of physical space. For Magnavox, FM stereo was not just a new feature. It was the ultimate justification for their massive wooden cabinets. To properly hear stereo separation, the left and right loudspeakers, the components that physically move air to create sound, needed to be spaced several feet apart. A small tabletop radio could never achieve this, but a 6-foot-long Magnavox French provincial console with massive bass drivers firing out of each end of the heavy wooden cabinet was acoustically perfect for the new era of high-fidelity FM broadcasting. Magnavox quickly dominated the premium stereo market. In 1962, they took another massive technological leap by introducing the Astrosonic line. This was the company's transition from vacuum tubes to solid-state electronics, a circuit design that used small, cool-running transistors instead of hot, fragile glass tubes to process and amplify the radio signal. Because transistors generated far less heat, Magnavox engineers could pack incredibly powerful 100-watt audio amplifiers directly into the enclosed wooden furniture without fear of warping the expensive cabinetry or drying out the varnishes. Operating a mid-1960s Magnavox Astrosonic console was a tactile, luxurious experience. There were no cheap plastic buttons. The American listener would slide back a heavy, perfectly balanced, hand-rubbed walnut top panel to reveal the brushed aluminum control deck. Because it was solid state, the sound was instantaneous. The heavily weighted tuning dial, the large illuminated knob used to glide across the broadcast band, moved with silky, hydraulic-like precision. When a homeowner in a wealthy Chicago suburb slid open the top of a 1965 Magnavox console, adjusted the precise bass and treble tone controls, and tuned the receiver to a local classical FM stereo station, they were not merely turning on an appliance. They were commanding the acoustic and visual center of the American home. This was the American radio mode at its absolute deepest. A Magnavox console was considered a lifetime purchase. To keep up with soaring demand for high-end cabinetry, the company expanded its woodworking operations even further, opening a massive state-of-the-art furniture manufacturing facility in Arden, North Carolina. By controlling the raw lumber, the component assembly in Indiana, and the final retail presentation, Magnavox insulated itself from the brutal, price-slashing chaos of the broader consumer electronics market. At its peak in the late 1960s, the Magnavox network consisted of roughly 2,000 carefully vetted, highly profitable franchise dealers across the United States. These were the most respected music stores and high-end furniture showrooms in their respective cities. They provided white-glove delivery, setting up the heavy consoles directly in the customer's living room, adjusting the antennas, the physical wires needed to capture the FM signal, and ensuring the system sounded flawless before leaving the house. By 1965, the company that had started in a small California workshop was grossing nearly $300 million annually. They had successfully merged cutting-edge acoustic engineering with traditional American furniture craftsmanship. They commanded the living room, they anchored the household, and they defined the standard for domestic audio luxury. The Magnavox console was heavy, it was expensive, and it was deeply respected. But it was built for an American culture that assumed the family would always gather in one room, around one massive piece of furniture, to listen together. That assumption was about to be broken. The decline of the American radio console did not begin with a drop in audio quality or a failure in engineering. It began with a profound demographic and cultural fracture. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the children of the post-war suburban generation were coming of age, and their listening habits were fundamentally different from those of their parents. The massive 200-pound French provincial Magnavox console was the ultimate centerpiece of the 1950s living room. But for a young adult in 1969, listening to an underground progressive rock FM station, that hand-rubbed mahogany cabinet represented the establishment. It was their parents' furniture. It was heavy, immovable, and visually old-fashioned. The American market was experiencing Force 5, a massive technological, retail, and listening culture shift. The new generation of listeners did not want hidden electronics enclosed in wooden cabinetry. They wanted component stereos, a system that separated the radio tuner, the audio amplifier, the record player, and the loudspeakers into distinct, highly technical-looking individual units. They wanted sleek, silver-faced stereo receivers, home audio components that combined a radio tuner, an amplifier, and input switching in one metal casing, paired with separate bookshelf loudspeakers, which were compact speakers designed to sit on a shelf or a stand rather than rest on the floor. This cultural shift toward visible, technical component audio exposed Magnavox to Force 1, American cabinet, component, labor, and manufacturing costs. Building a 6-foot-long solid cherry or walnut console at the Greenville, Tennessee, or Arden, North Carolina, plants required highly paid, specialized American woodworkers. It required massive physical space for assembly, multi-day varnishing processes, and immense shipping logistics. Moving a heavily padded 200-pound piece of delicate furniture from a North Carolina loading dock to a franchise dealer in Seattle, Washington, cost an absolute fortune in freight charges alone. Meanwhile, Japanese electronics manufacturers like Pioneer, Sansui, and Kenwood were flooding the American market with sleek, highly advanced, solid-state stereo receivers. These imported units were compact, packed in standard cardboard boxes, and could be shipped across the Pacific Ocean in massive cargo containers for a fraction of the cost of moving American furniture. Furthermore, the legendary Magnavox direct-to-dealer network, the exclusive retail pipeline that had protected the company's profit margins for 30 years, suddenly became a commercial trap. Young audiophiles were not walking into elite Main Street piano showrooms, formal furniture stores, or high-end department stores to buy their stereos. They were going to a new breed of retail environment, the dedicated hi-fi audio shop. Inside these new electronics stores, dozens of different brands were stacked against each other, connected to massive switchboards, so buyers could instantly compare the reception and sound of a Pioneer receiver against a Marantz or a Sony. Magnavox's strict franchise agreements meant their products were completely absent from these high-volume, youth-oriented retail environments. An entire generation of American FM stereo listeners was growing up without ever seeing the Magnavox name on a tuning dial. Magnavox executives attempted to adapt. They introduced their own lines of modular component stereos, smaller bookshelf radios, and portable audio devices. But the brand identity was stubbornly anchored to the massive living room console. To the emerging youth market, Magnavox was perceived as a traditional furniture company that happened to make radios, competing against dedicated foreign technology companies that made precision acoustic instruments. As the 1970s progressed, the sales of large radio phonograph consoles plummeted. The massive American cabinetry plants in the South, once the pride of the company, transitioned from an unassailable asset into a crushing financial liability. The heavy furniture simply sat in warehouses, waiting for a mid-century American living room culture that no longer existed. The acoustic empire that had physically invented the loudspeaker was running out of capital, running out of retail space, and running out of time. By 1974, the financial reality of maintaining massive American furniture plants while selling fewer and fewer heavy consoles had become completely unsustainable. Magnavox stock, once a blue-chip staple of the American consumer electronics industry, lost over 80% of its value in just a few short years. The company was structurally vulnerable, heavily in debt, and the global market was waiting to strip it for parts. That same year, the North American branch of Philips, the massive Dutch electronics conglomerate, De Meestes Duitsche Quarandammers, launched a hostile takeover, a corporate acquisition made against the wishes of the target company's executive management. Magnavox leadership fought the buyout bitterly in the press and the boardroom, but the shareholders, exhausted by declining revenues and an uncertain future, ultimately surrendered. Philips acquired the entirety of the Magnavox empire for roughly $150 million. Philips did not buy Magnavox because they respected the acoustic legacy of the Fort Wayne engineers. They did not buy it to save the traditional American radio console. They bought Magnavox specifically to acquire its legendary, deeply entrenched American distribution network. Philips desperately needed a trusted, recognized American brand name to sell their own color televisions, and later, to push their highly expensive, ill-fated Magnavision video disc players into American living rooms. Under foreign corporate ownership, the slow, agonizing process of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its prestigious name appears on products that no longer match the original engineering identity, began immediately. The premium radio phonograph console was officially declared dead by the new management. The massive, acoustically sealed wooden cabinets that had defined the company for 4 decades were no longer required. Consequently, the highly skilled American cabinet makers in Greenville, Tennessee, and Arden, North Carolina, were suddenly obsolete. The sprawling furniture plants were drastically scaled back, the heavy wood routers and sanding machines were powered down, and the facilities were eventually shut down entirely or sold off. The deep, familiar smell of varnish and cut mahogany that had characterized a Magnavox factory was replaced by the sterile scent of injection-molded plastics. Simultaneously, the exclusive direct-to-dealer network was systematically dismantled. Frank Freeman's strict rule that a Magnavox could never sit on a discount retail shelf was completely erased by Philips executives seeking maximum sales volume. They opened the brand to the emerging American big-box retailers, discount electronics chains, and massive generic department stores. A customer no longer had to visit a quiet, carpeted music showroom to buy a Magnavox. They could simply grab one off a metal rack at a regional discount mart. By the 1980s, the American consumer was fully experiencing Force 4, imports, private labels, and good enough listening. The Magnavox badge was officially stripped of its premium audio heritage and repurposed as a mid-tier budget label for imported electronics. The name that had introduced the world to the moving coil loudspeaker was now silk-screened onto cheap dual-cassette boomboxes, manufactured by third-party contractors in Asia. The physical degradation of the radio receiver itself was profound. The heavy, brushed aluminum tuning dials with their silky, flywheel-weighted tuning capacitors, components that smoothly changed the circuit's tuning to select one station from many, were replaced by stiff, grinding plastic gears. The massive 15-inch electrodynamic loudspeakers that could literally shake a living room floor were replaced by tiny 2-inch paper cones driven by incredibly weak ceramic magnets. The powerful 50-watt internal amplifiers were swapped for generic, low-power integrated circuit boards that distorted the audio signal at anything above a conversational volume. This technological shift also destroyed the relationship between the brand and the local American service network, the shops, technicians, and repair counters that kept radios working after sale. Before the 1980s, a Magnavox was a lifetime investment. If a vacuum tube burned out or a capacitor failed in a 1958 concert grand, the local franchise dealer sent a trained technician to the house to fix it. The back of the wooden cabinet could be easily unscrewed, and the heavy steel chassis was explicitly designed to be serviced. But the imported plastic Magnavox electronics of the 1980s and 1990s were actively hostile to the American repair bench. The plastic casings were often ultrasonically welded together or sealed with hidden plastic clips that snapped if forced open. Inside the cheap printed circuit boards carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, were mass soldered in overseas factories and virtually impossible to service by hand. If the tuning dial broke or the cheap speaker blew out, the unit could not be fixed. The American repair culture was entirely replaced by a replacement culture. The radio was simply thrown away. In the 1990s, the degradation of the brand reached its absolute floor. The remaining American audio engineering divisions had long been dissolved. If a shopper walked into a Kmart, a Target, or a Walmart, they would find the Magnavox logo stamped onto thin, silver-painted plastic portable stereos. They would find it on generic VHS players. And they would find it on $10 lightweight plastic digital clock radios. The exact disposable item that opened this story. These cheap radios were designed with planned obsolescence in mind. They were meant to sit on a nightstand, play a static-filled AM morning weather report, break down after 2 years, and be thrown into the trash without a second thought. There was no acoustic isolation. There was no pride in the reception. The name on the plastic casing was nothing more than a hollow, licensed trademark, deployed specifically to trick older American consumers who still remembered the magnificent, room-filling consoles of the 1950s. The collapse of the American acoustic empire was absolute. The direct-to-dealer network dissolved. The American furniture plants closed. The Fort Wayne lines stopped. The engineering moved overseas. The heavy wood became thin plastic. The precise dial felt cheap. The discount stores took the inventory. The repair shops were bypassed. The original acoustic promise died. The name meant nothing at all. Today, the Magnavox name is a ghost. In the 21st century, Philips chose to license the historic American trademark to various overseas manufacturers, most notably the Japanese conglomerate Funai Electric. If an American consumer walks into a massive discount retail chain today, they will not find a hand-rubbed mahogany console radio occupying a place of honor. Instead, they will find the Magnavox name printed on the thin cardboard boxes of budget flat-screen televisions, cheap Blu-ray players, and disposable plastic Bluetooth speakers. The brand that once defined premium domestic audio is now a mere licensing tool, a familiar badge used to sell entry-level electronics to modern shoppers who might vaguely remember the name from their grandparents' living rooms. The physical landscape of the original Magnavox empire has been largely erased. The massive Greenville, Tennessee cabinet plant, the sprawling industrial facility where highly skilled American woodworkers once milled raw walnut, oak, and cherry into heavy, acoustically sealed furniture, was eventually shuttered, sold, and repurposed, a victim of the broader collapse of domestic American furniture manufacturing. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, the original corporate headquarters and the sprawling engineering facilities that designed the legendary tube amplifiers are gone, replaced by generic commercial developments, office parks, and parking lots. The specific industrial infrastructure required to build a permanent, high-fidelity piece of American household architecture simply does not exist anymore. Yet, the original American engineering refuses to die. Across the country, a fiercely dedicated subculture of vintage radio collectors, audiophiles, and tube electronics restorers actively hunts for surviving mid-century Magnavox consoles. On antique radio forums, on Facebook Marketplace, and at local Midwestern estate sales, A 1950s or 1960s Magnavox is highly prized, not for its brand name, but for its raw, uncompromising acoustic machinery. Audio restorers often seek out these heavy cabinets specifically to extract the massive vacuum tube amplifiers. The heavy steel chassis packed with high-quality audio transformers, robust power supplies, and glowing glass tubes like the revered 6V6 or 6L6 output tubes. They harvest these parts because the pure, warm, distortion-free sound they produce still rivals modern high-end audio equipment, costing thousands of dollars. The true preservationists go even further. They refuse to scrap the wooden cabinets. Instead, they carefully replace the dried-out electrolytic capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit. They clean the heavy tuning capacitors, and they meticulously restore the hand-rubbed wooden finishes. They keep the old AM and FM dials glowing because they recognize the sheer physical quality of the original Indiana and Tennessee assembly lines. But the ultimate legacy of Magnavox contains a profound, almost invisible historical paradox. The company may have lost its premium American identity to cheap plastic imports and shifting retail logic, but the fundamental acoustic invention that originally launched the brand actually conquered the entire world. In 1915, in that small wooden workshop in Napa, California, Peter L. Jensen and Edwin S. Pridham invented the moving coil loudspeaker, the exact physical mechanism that uses an electrical voice coil suspended in a magnetic field to push a rigid diaphragm and create sound waves in the air. Today, long after the heavy wooden consoles have been dragged out of American homes and discarded, that exact same technology remains the undisputed standard for global audio. The modern consumer thinks they have moved beyond traditional radio. But the 1915 Magnavox invention is the physical heart of the smart speaker sitting on a modern kitchen counter. It is inside the wireless headphones of a commuting teenager. It is housed inside the doors of every modern car dashboard. It is inside every television, every laptop, and every smartphone. The original brand identity was thoroughly diluted, and the heavy cabinets were abandoned. But the foundational engineering DNA survived to power almost every single audio device on Earth. The American radio market is ruthless. It constantly praises acoustic innovation, but it ultimately rewards convenience, portability, and cost efficiency above all else. Magnavox built its mid-century empire on the firm belief that an American radio receiver should be a permanent, dedicated piece of fine furniture, commanding the absolute center of the home and delivering uncompromising reception. But the retail market eventually decided that sound did not require a heavy wooden cabinet. Sound only needed to be portable, inexpensive, and easily replaced when it broke. The company lost the living room because the American family fundamentally stopped gathering around a single glowing dial to listen together. Still, somewhere in a quiet Midwestern house, a heavy mahogany lid is lifted, a solid brass tone knob is turned, and the warm, amber glass dial of a 1958 concert grand lights up the dark room. See you in the next one.